I'm looking at Acts chapter 8 this evening, but I'm doing it in a very strange way. I'm going to start in an odd place and then finally get there when you think I've lost the plot. I'm going to actually get to the place we're meant to be. But what we've been doing in the series of Acts, we've been looking at one chapter a week. We're going to look at Acts chapter 2 over 2 weeks. But I'm going to start somewhere a little bit unexpected maybe. Over the last couple of months, I've been keeping on going back to a psalm because I'm in the process of praying through the Psalms at the moment. I know Paul is doing the same. I've been very inspired by a number of people talking about the power of using the Psalms for prayer. And there's a Psalm 77, which I love. And in Psalm 77, verse 19 to 20, it says this: "Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." And in these words, the psalmist is talking to people, or writing to people, reminding his readers, if you like, and maybe reminding himself that we must never doubt God's love. We must never doubt his care and his concern for us, that he is actively involved in creation, that he's actively involved with his people, that he is sovereign, and that he is working even when we can't see him and we can't feel him. I love what the psalmist says here. Though your footprints were not seen, like I couldn't see you in this place, but in that place you were leading your people like a flock by the hand. And on Father's Day, I know this is this imagery he's talking about, kind of a shepherd in one sense, but the way he speaks about leading a flock is kind of fatherly. He is our Father, and he leads us even when we can't see it, feel it, hear it. It doesn't feel like anything. He is there with us. But if you're a human being, it's easy, even if not natural, even if it's more than maybe easy, maybe it's natural to begin to doubt God, that in our worst moments, in our greatest times of crisis, that in some way we've been deserted by him. In some way, God has left the building. In some way, we've really hacked him off. Or maybe his plans have become thwarted. Maybe God's not as powerful as we thought. But there's some things we need to remember. What the Bible emphasizes and talks about is that God promises us that he will never leave us, nor will he forsake us. And in Joshua chapter 1, God speaks to Joshua just as he's about to go to the promised land. And he says to Joshua all these things, and in the middle of Joshua chapter 1, he says, "And Joshua, I want you to know, I will never leave you and I'll never forsake you." But sometimes we can hear those verses and we think, you know what? Oh, that's great. They relate to Joshua. But how do I know those words of Joshua relate to you, Emma? You, Nikki? How do I know that? Well, in Hebrews chapter 13, the writer of Hebrews uses those very same words and speaks them over the church. And he tells them, not to be worried in that area, in the area of finances. And he says to them, don't forget that your Father will never leave you, nor will he ever forsake you. And more than that, he will absolutely finish everything that he has started. He is the one who finishes. He is the one who completes. In the mornings, I get up and I say to myself, take my mug of coffee and my Starbucks mug, and I go and I walk outside into the glory portal, and I say to myself, Keath, you do not live under a curse. You do not live under a threat. Because when we feel we live under a curse or a threat, we live on a tightrope like this. But I say, no, Lord, I don't live under a curse. I don't live under a threat, but I live under a promise. I live under a promise that you will never leave me and you will never forsake me, that you will never give up on me, that you will finish this work that you have started. Because that's the type of Father we have. The other thing just to mention with this, when we feel like God has deserted us, or where is God? Where are his footprints? I was reading this, I'm reading the biography of Eugene Peterson at the moment, the guy who wrote The Message, and he says this: one of the mysteries of this life is that God isn't interested in solving all our problems in the ways we think they should be solved. God is not interested in solving our problems in the way we want them or we think they should be solved. And maybe that's the case because God knows there's something bigger at play for you and for me than we realize. Maybe there's something bigger for us. I'll try not to trip on that. Maybe there's something bigger for us than I actually realize. And one of the passages in the Bible which captures that for me is 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 to 7, where Peter is speaking to this church which is about to go under great persecution and into great difficulty. And he says this to them. He says, "In this you rejoice," that's their salvation, "though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." And I remember when I read this the first time, I thought I was disturbed by this word. If necessary, you're going through all these difficult trials, if necessary, for what purpose? For the refining of our faith. Because that is the only thing that we're taking with us. We're not taking our careers. We're not taking, our wonderful house. We're not taking our perfect health. The only thing that has value is our faith. Will we trust Him? And you will never have another moment in all of your life to trust God when you can't see Him, to trust Him when you can't feel Him, to trust Him when you can't experience Him or see Him in any way. It's only in this life. And there is a treasure in that. There's a preciousness in that. And He says to them, I'm allowing you to go through this time and these difficult moments so that your faith will be tested, be refined, to see how strong it is, to see does it stand up to the trials that we face. Because when we get through this, you'll see how beautiful and powerful this is. But maybe not only that God is allowing things for us to walk through the stormy water and to walk through trials, not only for us, but maybe because He's got a bigger plan for other people, a bigger plan for this world. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But it's that song that we sing and we all love. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I can't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You can all sing it any moment now. Just come into the chorus. You never stop working. You never stop working. And I've sung that many times, and I thought to myself, do I believe that? Do you believe that? Because that's what my message is about tonight, effectively, in a nutshell. In Psalm 77, the psalmist is talking about a period of history in Israel's history. God has saved Israel. He sent the plagues. The Egyptians have given them all the money. That off they go. They're heading off. And what does God do to the people He loves and He cares about and the people He saved? He takes them the long route. He doesn't take them the quick route to Canaan. There was a very quick, almost like straight route, like the toll road. You know, the toll road route, which just went straight to Canaan. He doesn't do that. He takes this curved road that goes around here, and He takes them to a place where they are trapped. He takes them to the sea. So to use that phrase, He puts them between the devil and the deep blue sea. And He says, I want you to be there. And they say, where are you, God? This is crazy, stupid. Why have you done this? Have you taken us out of Egypt to die in the desert? But why is God doing that? He takes them in this long route. He puts them in a place of perceived danger. He makes them feel vulnerable. And in that place, He performs a great miracle where He parts the sea. He destroys Pharaoh. And what He is doing in that moment, the miracle He's about to perform will define their understanding of God, define their understanding of their relationship with Him. It will be a reminder to them in other moments of difficulty that their God is a God who saves, that their God is a God who rescues them, that their God is a God who's greater than the greatest powers and the greatest enemies. But they would never have known that if they weren't taken by Him and placed in a place of vulnerability so that He can demonstrate His power. And that story, the story of the deliverance at the Red Sea, plays its way again and again and again in all the Old Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures. But He wasn't just doing that. He was taking them to that place so he could defeat Pharaoh. And defeating Pharaoh wasn't just about defeating another king. That's a spiritual battle, a spiritual warfare that is taking place. You see, for the Israelites, unaware of this, they didn't know the bigger things that were going on. They didn't know what their future was going to entail and how they were going to need that moment. They didn't understand the spiritual dynamics of what was at play. Well, a couple of weeks later, or even a couple of days later, God leads them through the desert. The people he loves, he leads them. And he lets them go without water for 3 days. I mean, what's up with that? So he takes them and there's no water. And it says in the Bible, he does it to test them. Because he's testing them in their heart to see what is in your heart. When things go wrong, when things seem difficult, will you doubt my love? Will you doubt my care? Will you doubt that I am with you? To see what is in that space. And you can read about this in Deuteronomy chapter 8 as well. But the Israelites, they failed this test. And here's an interesting thing. You know, God does test us. There's a number of places where he tests us. But he tests us not to see, oh, you failed, you're in hell. No, he tests us to see what's in our heart. To reveal stuff to us so that we can bring it to him and he can deal with it. But the Israelites fail this test and they cry out, is the Lord among us or not? And what that is kind of code for, if you like, is where is God? Does God even care? Does God love us? Can we trust him? Like, things are going bad. God must have deserted. I don't think he even loves me anymore. Have you ever had thoughts like that? Have you ever had feelings like that? Many years later, the Spirit of God leads Jesus into the wilderness. And whenever you read through the Gospels, Jesus is like a type for Israel. In fact, Jesus is the obedient Israel. The only obedient Israel is found in Jesus. And so when you go through the Gospels, you see so many parallels between Jesus' life and the life of Israel. But here we see, and before this, you know, he gets baptized. Jesus gets baptized. This is my son whom I love, and my son who I'm greatly pleased. And the son he loves, the one he's greatly pleased with, he takes him to the wilderness, where he's going to be tempted, where he's going to be hungry. And for 40 days he does that. But he comes out in power. But he needs to go through that wilderness time to come out in the power of God, to be used mightily by him in signs and wonders and miracles and everything that he's called to be and called to do. But God allows him to go through. And at the essence of this battle that Jesus takes as he goes through the wilderness is this kind of temptation which says, how could a father who loves you so much let you stay here? How could a father who loves you so much let you go through difficulties? How could he do that, Jesus? And what does Jesus do? He actually quotes one of the scriptures from Deuteronomy, which reflects the way the Israelites rebelled against God at Meribah, when they said, where is God? Does he love us? There's no water here. And he quotes Deuteronomy 6:16. He says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah or Meribah. He requotes that scripture. He says, I'm not going to fail like the Israelites failed. I'm not going to doubt your love for me at this moment. But I'm going to continue to trust God even when I can't feel it, even when I can't see it. And I'm going to put my belief in him. Where Israel fails, Jesus is victorious. And he goes through the wilderness. And many people, many theologians believe that it is actually in that wilderness moment that Jesus defeats the devil in that space. He confirms it at the cross, but in that place, he gains victory over the devil. But the devil comes back to him at another time in the Garden of Gethsemane when the Spirit of God is leading Jesus through the cross. You see, we often want God to take us around the waters. We want Jesus to take us around the cross. Do you know that we are also called? We are to pick up our cross and follow Jesus. We go through, in one sense, we go through the cross with Jesus. But he doesn't take us around those moments. And the enemy comes and we're not sure of all the details of what Satan may have tempted with Jesus with there. But what we see is that he goes through that cross and he wins the victory for all of us. And our delight is that because Jesus won that victory through the devil in the desert and through the cross, his victory is our victory. And therefore, when we're not feeling strong, when we're going through difficult moments, and when we feel like we're trapped, when we feel like we're going through strong waters, you don't have to rely on your own strength and your own ability, but you can rely on the power of the Spirit that was within you. The Spirit which says, I love you, I love you, I love you. Now, after that little journey, we're going to come to the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 8, it starts off, I'm just going to read from Acts chapter 8, verse 1 to 4. And Saul approved his execution. That's Stephen's execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Chapter 7 ends, and chapter 8 begins with the killing of Stephen and a significant ramping up of persecution, a significant ramping up of pain and difficulty and awkwardness. And yet what we see in this as we go through this chapter and the rest of the book of Acts is that God uses these circumstances as a catalyst to see the gospel spread. Jesus has promised that the gospel is going to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And that's what we see. And in chapter 8, what you see in the rest of chapter 8 is you see Philip, who was a deacon, going out and preaching in Samaria, taking the gospel, the Spirit of God pouring out. He speaks to an Ethiopian eunuch. There is this amazing move and power of the gospel, and catalyzed, if you like, by the pain and the suffering and the difficulty of persecution. It says, as they were scattered, they went about preaching the word. So what looks like a terrible thing is ultimately being used by God for his glory and blessing of the world. That amazing promise that he gave to Abraham, I'm going to bless you and you're going to be a blessing to the world. This promise that he gave to Abraham now begins to spread from Jerusalem to Samaria, to Greece, to modern-day Turkey, to Antioch, to Rome. And it happens as the fire of persecution begins to burn in Jerusalem. And one of the things which I noted when I was preparing for this message is that in Acts chapter 8, you see Saul, who's mentioned, the one who's bringing all the persecution. And you see Philip, who has to flee because of what Saul is doing. Yet in Acts 21, you see Saul, who's now Paul, enters into Philip's house as a Christian, on his way to a similar fate to Stephen. And he finds the prophetic words. He receives prophetic words. And he receives encouragement from the one who had to flee his home because of Saul's persecution that he brought. Isn't it amazing how God works? He's always working. And the symmetry of this. It must have been so hard for them to see this as the stones were hitting Stephen, as the crowd were cheering, as they mocked Stephen, as the people stormed into houses and teared families apart. It would be so hard to see God in this moment. The realization that the church was not going to ever be the same again. That what they'd known in Jerusalem and way church was, and the relationships and the friendships and the people who were there that they all knew and are scattered, it was not going to be the same. Yet God's hand is working, and he's leading the church through difficult waters to something far better. He's leading that church in Jerusalem through difficult waters to something which is far bigger than a gospel to the Jewish people. It's about a gospel to the nations. You see, there's something bigger at play. And when I started thinking about this passage, I started thinking about the impact of the COVID crisis on the church. And I'm not saying that God caused the COVID crisis, but I honestly believe He's using it, and He has used it. And all the chaos that seems to be taking place in the world at the moment, whether it's war or economic instability or COVID crisis, whatever it might be, I think God is using it to prune the church, to strengthen us for what He has in store for us, for something better than we can imagine. And I think it's an important thing for us to hold on to. Because I think church feels very different. I mean, not just us, but every church feels different to 2019 and to 2018. And if we want to hark back to 2018, 2017, we've missed the boat. God is taking us through something for His plans and for His purposes. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, it says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for the good, for those who are called according to His purpose." For those who are called according to His purpose. His church called according to His purpose. The promises that when we look at our lives, He will work all things to the good for that. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that happens in our life is God ordained. I can't imagine that. I can't look at the horror of Auschwitz and thought, God, He ordained Auschwitz. But what I believe this passage is saying is that when God looks at our lives in its totality, He takes it all, and somehow by His grace and by His glory, He works it all together in the end for His glory and His goodness. And you know what that means? Is that none of our suffering is wasted. None of our suffering is wasted, because somehow God takes the most brutal, horrible moments in our lives, and because of His grace and because we are called to His purposes, He takes the moments which are causing us suffering, and He molds them and He shapes them and somehow brings His glory out of them, and He brings our joy and goodness out of it. I mentioned this this morning as well. In Luke chapter 21, Jesus is talking about the end times. He's talking about, or not the end times, He's talking about the difficulties that the church is going to go through. And He says, people are going to hate you. They're going to talk badly about you. You're going to be brought before kings, etc. And, some of you are going to die, but not a hair on your head will be hurt. Well, obviously, can you see the problem there? You're going to die, but not a hair on your head is going to be hurt. So what is Jesus saying about that? I think one of the things Jesus is saying is He's saying that even when you go through death, I'm holding you. Even when you go through death, I want you to know that I'm holding you and keeping you, and I will finish what I started. And I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you. I've got you the whole way through this life, through death. I have you in my hand. I know what I want you to do is I want you to trust me. I want you to know that even though you can't see my footprints, they're here. And I'm right next to you. And I'm carrying you. And one day, you will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. You will see Him face to face. And you will know the extent of His love and the extent of His kindness towards you. I was thinking about this in the context of church, but even in your own lives, I know as a pastor in this church, I know the stories, most of the stories of people, what they're going through. And some of them are very difficult. But God is there with you. He's carrying you. He's leading you. What I want to do tonight is we usually break into groups and we have questions. But I'm not going to do that tonight. What I want to do is as we break into groups, I want us to pray for one another that we would get an increasing revelation of the Father's love for us. Because the thing that helps us cope through moments of difficulty, through moments of chaos, is knowing that we're loved, that we're loved, that we're loved, that we're loved.